uncover the mystery behind China's drastic decision. China's move has sent the recycling world into a frenzy.
We don't want your recyclable trash.
When it comes to importing garbage, no country bought in more of it than China. The nation was the world's largest importer of trash until January, when it started banning some recycled imports. And now that ban is in full effect.
So Cambodia, Malaysia, Philippines, China, all of them have come together to say it is time for America's trash to go home. America sent China its recycling. China turned it into fake Louis Vuitton bags. But then, just like your ex, after a while, China decided it was sick of taking trash.
The trade tariffs haven't helped. So I suppose there you got to blame our administration and China's administration.
Did you hear about China slamming the door on U.S. recyclables? Wondering why this matters or what it means for our trash at home? And what on earth do we do with all our recycling now? Welcome back, guys. Today, we're diving into a huge shift in the recycling world that's causing quite a stir. Imagine if your favorite grocery store suddenly stopped carrying your go-to products. You'd be scrambling to find alternatives, right? That's exactly what's happening now that China has decided to stop importing recyclables from the US. For years, they were the recycling powerhouse handling our discarded paper and plastics. But now, we're left with a big question. What do we do next? In this video, I'll walk you through the history of this recycling partnership, why it's ending, and what it means for you and me. We'll also look at the ripple effects on the environment and global recycling markets. Stay tuned as we uncover the facts and explore how this shakeup could lead to better recycling practices in the long run. Let's get into it. All right, let's take a trip back in time to understand how we got here. For years, a big chunk of the stuff we threw in our recycling bins, especially paper and plastics, ended up on ships bound for China. Now, you might be wondering, why ship our trash all the way to China? Well, China is the world's largest manufacturer, cranking out tons of consumer goods, packaging, and plastic products. To keep their factories humming, they needed a steady supply of raw materials, and our recyclables fit the bill perfectly. Back in the 1990 and early 2000, China's economy was booming, and their demand for raw materials was sky high. So, they started importing waste materials from all over the world, especially from the US.
By 2012, China was receiving nearly half of all the recycling that Americans shipped out of the country.
By 2016, the US was sending about 16 million tons of recyclables to China every year. Just think about that for a moment. 16 million tons. China was handling nearly half of the world's discarded materials. It was a win-win situation. U.S. companies made money by selling their recyclables, and China got the raw materials they needed for their manufacturing juggernaut. This arrangement worked like a well-oiled machine for years. But now, with China's decision to ban these imports, it's like throwing a wrench into the gears. All right, so we had this seemingly perfect recycling partnership going with China, but beneath the surface, there were some serious issues. Let's talk about those. In the US, we use what's called a single-stream recycling system. It sounds convenient because you can toss all your recyclables into one bin. Paper, plastic, glass, whatever. But this convenience comes with a big downside: contamination. Non-recyclable items often sneak in, mucking up the whole batch. It's like trying to bake a cake with rotten eggs. One bad ingredient ruins the mix. China was getting tired of dealing with our messy recyclables. They were basically saying, hey, we asked for recyclables, not your trash. Their tolerance for contaminated materials was wearing thin. And then, to top it off, a powerful documentary called Plastic China came out. This film pulled back the curtain on the grim reality of plastic waste in China. It showed the devastating environmental and health impacts on communities dealing with mountains of plastic junk. The public was outraged, and the Chinese government knew they had to make some big changes. So the perfect storm of high contamination and public pressure led to a major policy shift. China decided it was done being the world's dumping ground. They tightened up their standards and eventually banned the import of many types of waste materials. This move was like a wake-up call, forcing us to confront the flaws in our own recycling system. So how did China start tackling this contamination issue? In 2013, they rolled out a policy called Operation Green Fence. Think of it like putting up a big "no trespassing" sign around their borders, but for trash. This operation meant that all incoming recyclable materials were subject to strict inspections. If the recyclables were too contaminated, they got rejected. No more sneaking in non-recyclable junk under the radar. Operation Green Fence was just the beginning, like a warning shot saying, "Hey, clean up your act." China was serious about reducing the amount of dirty, unusable waste they were receiving. They tightened their inspections even more, turning away shipments that didn't meet their cleaner standards. This move sent a clear message to countries like the US. We needed to start paying attention to what we were tossing into our recycling bins. As the inspections got stricter and the acceptance of contaminated recyclables dropped, it became clear that this was more than a temporary crackdown. China was laying the groundwork for even tougher policies down the line. This was their way of saying they were no longer willing to be the world's recycling bin. The ripple effects of this decision were huge, pushing other countries to rethink their recycling strategies and focus on reducing contamination at the source.
We, meaning America, relied on China for 23 years to take half of our stuff, our raw material, our recycled garbage, if you will, and we no longer can rely on China.
Now, even with Operation Green Fence, the contamination problem didn't go away. So, in 2017, China decided to kick things up a notch with the National Sword Policy. Imagine this as China drawing a line in the sand saying, "Enough is enough." They slashed the acceptable contamination levels from a somewhat lenient 5 to 10% down to a near impossible 0.5%. Plus, they banned the import of 24 types of solid waste altogether. This was like saying, we only want the cleanest, purest recyclables, or don't bother sending them at all. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Plastic imports to China plummeted by 99%, sending shockwaves through the global recycling markets. Suddenly, all the recyclables that used to head to China had nowhere to go. It was like closing the main gate and forcing everyone to find new routes. Recycling facilities around the world were caught off guard, scrambling to deal with the overflow of materials that China would no longer take.
I've seen lots of bad markets in the 30 years I've been doing this, but I've never seen anything like this. It's had a dramatic impact on the entire industry, east to west, north to south.
And China wasn't done yet. In 2018, they introduced the Blue Sky Initiative, tightening regulations even more and adding more items to the banned list. It was as if they were putting the final nails in the coffin of the old way of doing things. The combined effect of National Sword and Blue Sky was a massive reduction in the importation of contaminated recyclables. These policies forced the rest of the world to rethink and restructure their recycling systems.
The president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, even made it very clear to Canada that the trash was not welcome, to send it back to Canada.
Your garbage is on the way. Prepare a grand reception. Eat it if you want to.
China's tough new policies aimed to clean up their environment, but they caused a major headache for U.S. municipalities and recycling facilities. With China no longer accepting contaminated recyclables, processing costs in the U.S. shot up as facilities had to work harder to clean up the materials. On top of that, finding new markets to send recyclables became a top priority. This shift meant the U.S. had to invest heavily in improving its own recycling infrastructure and technology. Consider this. Between 1992 and 2018, China imported a whopping 45% of the world's plastic waste. In 2016 alone, 72% of the plastic scrap exported by the U.S. went to China. So when China slammed the brakes with their new regulations, the U.S. was left with a massive pile of recyclables and nowhere to send them. Exports of recycled paper and plastic to China nosedived, leaving U.S. recyclers scrambling for solutions. This situation forced the U.S. to take a hard look at its recycling system. Instead of relying on China, the focus shifted to finding new markets and boosting domestic recycling capabilities. This meant investing in better sorting technologies, expanding recycling facilities, and educating the public on reducing contamination. The goal? To build a more self-reliant and efficient recycling system that could handle the waste without depending so heavily on other countries.
How has your business been affected by China's ban on plastics?
With our business, it's actually been a net positive. We use curbside, which is what comes from households and picked up at the curb by the garbage truck, and that's why it's called curbside. And with that material, it had predominantly been sent to China, and when China stopped accepting it, it actually left a greater volume of those bales in California and elsewhere throughout the United States. So it's been a net positive for us in terms of the supply of the material that we need to run the plant.
Now, let's talk about the environmental cost of shipping recyclables overseas. Transporting all that waste from the U.S. to China isn't just a logistical challenge. It's a major source of CO2 emissions. Picture this. Those recyclables have to travel thousands of miles across the ocean. Every one of those journeys adds up to a significant carbon footprint. Maritime transport, which includes those massive cargo ships, emits about 0.01 to 0.02 kilograms of CO2 per ton kilometer. Now, let's put that into perspective. In 2018, international shipping as a whole was responsible for around 2.89% of global CO2 emissions. That's roughly 1.06 billion metric tons of CO2. So every time we shipped our recyclables to China, we were contributing to a hefty chunk of those emissions. It's like trying to clean up our trash while simultaneously polluting the air. Pretty counterproductive, right? With China's new policies pushing us to handle our recyclables at home, there's a silver lining. By cutting down on these long-haul shipments, we can significantly reduce our carbon footprint. It's a step towards not only improving our recycling processes, but also making them more environmentally friendly. So, as we adjust to this new reality, we're not just finding new places for our recyclables, we're also taking a big step forward in the fight against climate change. So, while China's decision to ban imports might have caused some disruption, it's also important to recognize their strides in recycling. By 2021, China had boosted its plastic recycling rate to over 30%, which is 1.7 times higher than the global average. From 2011 to 2020, they recycled a whopping 170 million tons of plastic waste. That's not just impressive, it's crucial for the planet. By recycling all that plastic, China saved a staggering 510 million tons of crude oil and prevented 61.2 million tons of CO2 emissions. And that wraps up our journey through the twists and turns of China's recycling policies and their global impact. Thanks for sticking with us through this eye-opening exploration. If you found this video informative or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And to watch the latest geopolitical news, watch this video here.